Aloha, and welcome to another edition of Kanaka Express. My name is Kale Gumapac, and I'll be hosting the show tonight, and I'd like to thank you for welcoming us into your home. I have two guests with me that you have seen many times on the show. I have Dr. Keanu, who is a political scientist with lots and lots of information and research that he has done, both here in Hawaii and also the work that he's doing internationally. And I also have attorney Dexter Kaiama, who has been very, very instrumental in taking care of cases or arguing cases in the courts throughout Hawaii. And so tonight we're going to be discussing and trying to define and clear up what war crimes are and what's taking place internationally and the effects that it has here at home. And so, Dr. Sai, with that, can you explain what war crimes are? Because there's some confusion with people here in Hawaii, and they're saying, war crimes, huh? So can you explain what war crimes are and how it's defined here and being used here in Hawaii?
Well, the term war crimes didn't come about in international law until around 1919. That was during the First World War. Prior to that, violations of international law were not considered crimes, but rather delicts or just violations of international law that the country itself would pay compensation or reparations. You wouldn't be convicting members of that country's government for particular crimes. But in 1919, during World War I, the Allied countries took it upon themselves to now take international law to another level. And because of the atrocities that were taking place in World War I, they wanted to hold commanders and even heads of government accountable to be prosecuted. Okay, so that's when war crimes first came about. And it didn't start off with war crimes are here and then they're going to prosecute. It was a developing process because people within the international community who was part of this task force that was created by the Allies were saying that there's a problem with the war crimes because these individuals in government are carrying out the orders of the head of state or of the army. So it's really a matter of the position and responsibility of the country, not the position and responsibility of the individuals. So they're going through that problem. In fact, the United States of America had a problem with that. Okay. They did prosecute some individuals during World War I for war crimes, okay, the Germans and the Ottoman Turks, but it wasn't on a large scale that they had planned. But when World War II broke out, that's when the war crimes began to be applied after the war, most notably the Nuremberg Trials in 1945. Now, the reason why they had a problem with war crimes and war is because under international law, war is legal. Okay? It's not unlawful. You can actually go to war, but you just got to be justified to go to war. And international law regulates war, which is called the laws and customs of war. So this is what they're trying to figure out. How exactly would it apply to individuals as opposed to applying to the country and the army? Yeah, and World War II kind of flushed that out. And then it became accepted that individuals of countries can be accountable to war crimes. Now, after World War II, they began to realize that the term war was, it needed to be adjusted. Because during World War I, you had Germany invading and occupying Luxembourg without any resistance. And Luxembourg was a neutral country. And Germany was using Luxembourg as a staging point to fight against France. Okay, so how would you refer to that situation between Luxembourg and Germany? Now, between Germany and France, that's a war, you know. But what do you say is happening between Germany and Luxembourg? So because of these instances of Luxembourg, Belgium, Sweden, these neutral countries being taken or seized to fight other belligerents, that's when they had to come up with a new term. And after 1945, you had the beginning of the Geneva Conventions, where the countries began to meet. And in 1949, they adopted a new word. Instead of just war, now it's called an international armed conflict. And an armed conflict expands war to include territory that has been occupied even when there's no resistance, like what happened in 1914 to Luxembourg. Okay, so that's kind of the background of war and war crimes. Okay, now a war crime is basically a violation of the laws and customs of war on land.
So how does a country be brought up on war crime charges, or individuals? Do they have to be part of the conventions?
No. They said that because war is legal and the laws and customs of war regulate war, which is legal, war crimes are considered customary international law. So what was taking place in the Hague and Geneva Conventions are merely codifications of customary international law. So they didn't create the idea, they just morphed it and continued it from the laws and customs of war on land. So a war crime is a violation of the laws and customs of war. Now, a war crime can be a direct, deliberate act called destruction of property. Okay, so in the Hague Convention, it says you can't destroy public property. Okay, and that is a subject of legal proceedings. So that would be considered a war crime. Okay, but Article 43 of the Hague Convention says that the occupier, during an occupation, must administer the laws of the occupied state. Now, if the country did not, who is occupying the other country, did not administer the laws of the occupied state, that's called an omission. Okay, it's an omission of a duty. War crimes include deliberate acts like destruction of property, but also omission to administer the laws of the occupied state, which would lead to create an outcome of additional war crimes, because the failure to administer the laws of the occupied state, one case would be taxation. If Germany goes into Luxembourg, they're not supposed to be collecting German taxes in Luxembourg. They're supposed to be collecting Luxembourg taxes, with the Germans being the provisional government for Luxembourg. That's Article 43, administration of the laws of the occupied state during the occupation. But if they omit to administering Luxembourg law and they administer German law instead, then that takes on the war crime of pillaging or unlawful appropriation of property. Yeah? So by not administering the laws of an occupied state, will create many different war crimes that would stem from that.
So you mentioned that the war crimes initially was designed for filing war crimes against countries. And so now we have...
No, actually war crimes was only against individuals, not countries.
Okay.
Yeah, so from World War I to World War II, they were trying to figure that out. How do you apply war crimes on individuals during war when those individuals are carrying out the orders of the country who's at war, which is supposed to be legal? So that's when they had to articulate what exactly is a war crime within the laws and customs of war that would be attributable to an individual or individuals. So a case in point would be this. You have an army going into a battle, and they win, okay? And the victor goes in, and they start taking watches and pulling the wallets off of the bodies of the enemy, and are putting it in their pocket. That's a private, that's an issue of robbery taking place by a private person, not by a government who is collecting taxes on behalf of the country's taxation. That right there is pillaging. Okay, so then that individual or individuals would be subject to pillaging, because pillaging is forbidden in the laws and customs of war throughout the 19th century to the Geneva Conventions. So these are individual war crimes. So like another case would be unfair trial. The occupier has his individuals administering the law in a judicial capacity, but they're not administering the laws of the occupied state. By not administering the laws of the occupied state, let's say that's Germany and France during the occupation, what they created there was an unfair situation. That means the citizenry of France is facing a different type of law that doesn't apply in their country, and that creates an unfair trial. And any sentence or judgment coming out of an unfair trial is part of that war crime.
Okay, so you've described that. So how does it apply to Hawaii? I mean, people are confused and saying, well, there's no war crimes being committed here.
Right. I mean, the first thing you say is when you mention war crimes, you're like, oh, genocide, Holocaust, Auschwitz. Those are war crimes,
Yeah.
but that's actually crimes against humanity. Okay. War crimes are more specific. Okay. Genocide is another form of an international crime. Okay. Now, and that's where also they were, and since you brought that up about genocide, which is mass murder, these commissioners of the Allied countries in 1919 were taking up these issues of war crimes because of what the Ottoman Turks did by wiping out Armenians. That was a major massacre, yeah, of Armenians. That was taken up as to whether or not they need to prosecute those individuals, the Turks, okay, as well as the Germans. So genocide just started to be addressed during World War I and then solidified in World War II, but it doesn't encompass war crimes. It's a part of crimes against humanity and war crimes itself. You know, they're still teasing out they're trying to articulate what exactly applies and what doesn't apply. What applies to the country as well as applying to the individual. Yeah. So when you talk about war crimes in Hawaii, first of all, Hawaii needs to be a country, not want to become a country. So if you operate from Hawaii being a part of the United States, but it wants to break away to be a part of the United States, you can't say war crimes are being committed in Hawaii because Hawaii is a part of the United States. Okay. If Hawaii is not a part of the United States and it's its own country, then how did America get here? Well, America got here on 2 points. Hawaii was military occupied by the United States twice. The first occupation began, military occupation, which was an act of war admitted to by President Cleveland, which started on January 16, 1893. U.S. troops landed by order of the U.S. Embassy. And that occupation continued until April 1st, 1893, when James Blount came to Hawaii to do an investigation and concluded they're not a real government, they're an armed force, they're self-declared. Okay. But the U.S. Marines left April 1st. The second occupation began during the Spanish-American War. And formal ceremonies were done on August 12, 1898 at Iolani Palace. Full military formations and the lowering of the Hawaiian flag and the raising of the American flag. That occupation took place during the Spanish-American War. And Hawaii was used as a staging point to fight the Spanish in Guam and the Philippines. I've read somewhere somebody says that U.S. military was coming to Hawaii for R&R, rest and relaxation. I don't know what book that person is reading, you know. They were coming here specifically to fight. This was a staging point. And the United States intentionally violated the neutrality of the Hawaiian Kingdom by entering Honolulu Harbor to refuel and then head off to Guam and the Philippines. In Guam and the Philippines, fighting did not stop until August 13th, the day after Hawaii was occupied. So we were seized during hostilities. Then you had an armistice, okay? And then you had the final treaty signed, which was December of 1898. December of 1898. But the actual war did not end until ratifications were exchanged on that Treaty of Paris until 1899. Okay, so you really got to see how this thing plays out, because during that time, first of all, was Hawaii its own country? Yes, it was. Okay. Did Hawaii become a part of the United States? No, because there's no treaty that Hawaii became a part of the United States. In fact, all we have is U.S. laws passed by Congress claiming to be imposed in Hawaii as if Hawaii is a part of the United States. That's no different than what Germany was doing to Luxembourg in World War II, just imposing their laws, which created the situation for war crimes during the Nuremberg Trials. So we weren't a part of the United States, but we were treated like we were, and that's where another war crime was committed on a massive scale called attempts to denationalize the inhabitants of an occupied territory. And that's a specific war crime, because in Hawaii, the public schools were taken over, the Hawaiian Kingdom schools, and that's when, in my case, my grandparents' generation were programmed to believe they're American. And all they knew was red, white, and blue. And by the time it got to my parents, that information has already been institutionalized in the system. And by the time it got to me, when I might come in my schools, it's a no-brainer. I thought I was an American. And when you think about it, that's just 3 generations. That's how quick it happened. And that cannot take place unless there was a very good plan and policy to implement. And we are the byproduct of that. So the fact that people don't know that Hawaii was a country is evidence of the indoctrination. Because if we can show that Hawaii was a country before the United States showed up, why didn't you know that? Why is it that you think Hawaii, like Native Hawaiians are like Native Americans? That's because we're led to believe that. That doesn't make it true. So when you look at Hawaii as a country, it's undeniable. It is. My doctoral dissertation covers that in great detail. And it's not something that I've come to the conclusion on in the last year. You know, this is very diligent research and analytical rigor, and you're always working with other academics and scholars. So this is not speaking to something in a vacuum, in an empty space where you fill it with your own words. You know? This is very much grounded in facts, in theoretical framework, methodology, resources, documents, and it is undeniable. And what people should also remember, if they may have forgotten, is that the United States Congress in 1993 passed a resolution apologizing for the illegal overthrow. I mean, just think about that. And now the resolution is riddled with misinformation, but the fact that they apologize for an illegal overthrow, next question would be, when did it become legal then? If you apologize, it was because it was illegal. So these kind of things are now starting to come to the fore. And now we're starting to see the effect that it has on us. And especially in light of education at the university, high schools, elementary, intermediate, preschools. We're talking about Mauna Kea, Haleakala. We're talking about other countries, treaties with Hawaii that still exist. Everything is starting to come out. Yeah? And it's pretty much undeniable.
So international law, is that now overseeing the occupation of Hawaii today?
Well, the term international law is very different from domestic law. So you have a difference between national law, which applies to the nations themselves, and international law that applies between the nations. Okay, so the Hawaiian Kingdom has national laws called its laws, the Civil and Criminal Code. The United States has its national laws, their statutes. Okay, and then you have international law, a law between 2 nations, and these are treaties, and customary international law or principles. So Hawaii has always been, in its relationship with other countries, international law. But if you're in Hawaii, it's Hawaiian law. If you're in America, it's American law. If you're in Switzerland, it's Swiss law. Yeah.
Okay, which would include the Geneva and the Hague Conventions, because Hawaii is part of the family of nations, is that correct?
Well, they've never left the family. You just might say we got knocked out and we've been in a coma for a while. We're just slowly waking up.
Yeah.
But the United States entered into as a party to the Geneva Convention and the Hague Conventions. The Hawaiian Kingdom didn't, because that came in 1899 and 1949. That's after 1893. But it is clear that the Hague Convention and the Geneva Conventions is a reflection of codifying what was already considered customary international law when the Hawaiian Kingdom existed. So the Hawaiian Kingdom does not need to be a party to the Hague Convention in order to have the Hague Convention apply to Hawaii. But the United States is a party to the Hague Convention and the Geneva Convention, and they're the ones occupying Hawaii, so it applies to them even more so, because they signed off on it.
Well, let me ask Attorney Dexter Kaiama. You've been in court a lot, with various clients and arguing subject matter jurisdiction. What's been, pretty much the response of the courts, and what is the problem that you're seeing in arguing that subject matter jurisdiction?
Thank you, Kali, and thank you for inviting me on the show. First off, as you know, the motions that we filed in the courts on behalf of my clients in both civil cases and criminal cases was challenging the very authority of the courts to begin with, and that lack of subject matter jurisdiction. I essentially used the information and the expert witness testimony of Dr. Sai and all of the facts and evidence provided in his research as part of our argument, our position that the courts are unlawfully constituted. And if the courts are unlawfully constituted and they are not administering Hawaiian Kingdom law, but in fact U.S. law, they are depriving my clients of a fair and regular trial, which is listed as one of the violations or listed as a war crime. So what we've done is we've taken what's been codified in the Geneva Conventions, the list of war crimes. An unfair and regular trial is one of that list, and we've been presenting it to the courts. We've been providing them with the information and telling them they are unlawfully constituted. And if they continue to pursue the matters before them and continue to retain subject matter jurisdiction, they will violate they will violate my client's right to a fair and regular trial, a violation of the Geneva Convention, international law. Kali, as you know, I've been doing this for about 5 years, and I've been before all of the courts in the circuit courts of the state of Hawaii, and we've presented this information most recently in what's known as the Molokai fisherman's case as by way of an evidentiary hearing, where Dr. Sai was qualified as an expert witness in this area, qualified and adopted by the court as an expert witness without objection by the prosecution. We presented all of this evidence, as well as Dr. Sai's expert memorandum opinion, which was judicially noticed by the court and Judge Cardoza. And despite all of this evidence that we've met and we've provided, the courts have refused to acknowledge their obligation under rule of law that they are not lawfully constituted, and they must, and their obligation is to dismiss the complaint for lack of subject matter jurisdiction. One other part of it is that Hawaii case law has set the boundaries for determining whether they have subject matter jurisdiction or not, and that case is known as State of Hawaii versus Lorenzo. And in their case, they've said when the defendant can provide facts and evidence to conclude that the Hawaiian Kingdom continues to exist with the attributes of a state sovereign nature, then we have met our burden to show that the courts lack subject matter jurisdiction. And by doing so, we have also met the requirements of another state Supreme Court case in Nishitani versus Baker, where the court clarified State of Hawaii versus Lorenzo and said, despite the fact that it's defendant's burden to show that the Hawaiian Kingdom continues to exist, the initial burden from showing that the court has subject matter jurisdiction always rests with the plaintiff, or in criminal cases, the prosecution. And the prosecution must prove the court has subject matter jurisdiction beyond a reasonable doubt. So if the court accepts Dr. Sai's testimony as an expert witness and accepts his expert memorandum by way of judicial notice without objection by the prosecution, we have met our burden under Lorenzo, State of Hawaii versus Lorenzo, and prevented the prosecution from ever meeting its initial burden under State of Hawaii, under Nishitani versus Baker. Despite the fact, let me just back up. When the court adopts all of that information and all of that evidence and it's introduced into the record, but yet denies the motion, it's not only inconsistent with their own ruling in State of Hawaii versus Lorenzo, but the court by its decision has in fact retained subject matter jurisdiction that it does not legally have and is depriving my clients of a fair and regular trial in violation of the Geneva Convention.
And also to note, when Dexter's arguing the case, he's not saying, the clients cannot be held accountable for whatever allegations is thrown out, but rather this is not the right court. So when I was brought up as an expert witness in this trial, the issue wasn't that we're talking about or speaking to the guilt or innocence of the defendants. We're talking about whether or not the defendants are going to get a fair trial, okay? And the court itself is not properly constituted. So you can't get a fair trial. But if this court begins to comply with the laws of occupation in administration of Hawaiian law, then they may be able, I'm not going to say they can, they may be able to continue with the prosecution. But it has to be done within the laws and customs of war through the Hague and Geneva Conventions and Hawaiian Kingdom law. So I just want to make sure that for people watching this show, we're not advocating that this place is going to get thrown into chaos. But people need to be held accountable to a certain standard.
In fact, in some cases, some attorneys have tried to snidely comment that if it's not United States law, then they could actually conduct themselves without any consequences. One attorney mentioned that I could take a gun and shoot someone and I wouldn't be held responsible. And I reminded the court, as I've always done, that there is a court that would prosecute this man or would be there to retain jurisdiction over that criminal event. And that would be a court that administers Hawaiian Kingdom law. And remind the court, I remind that and that attorney that under Hawaiian law, Hawaiian Kingdom law, the penalty for murder is death. So I said his consequence for his act that he's talking about is even more severe than any consequence that would be meted under Hawaii state law.
Yeah, so what's been the response of the courts when you argue subject matter jurisdiction with, I've seen some of the briefs that you've submitted with overwhelming evidence, and what has been their response and the judges involved?
By and large, most of the courts in my arguments have responded in no way at all. They've basically been silent. And despite all the argument, they've continued to rule against me. Again, inconsistent with the evidence that's been presented and adopted, inconsistent with their own case, State of Hawaii versus Lorenzo, and again, depriving my clients of a fair and regular trial.
So are the plaintiffs presenting evidence to refute what you've presented?
In my 4 years, no. Not once have they provided any evidence to dispute the evidence that we've presented. And generally speaking, in the court of law, when there's two sides to a dispute, and one side presents evidence to support its case, it is obligatory on the other side to present evidence which disputes it. Failure to provide evidence to dispute the evidence that's been presented by one side should almost always result in that side which presented the evidence in prevailing. So no party has ever presented any evidence to dispute what I presented through Dr. Sai and the information. Now, what they've tried to argue is that the courts have already decided these cases and there's a whole slew of case law. Most importantly, they've cited what's called the Kaulia decision. And in Kaulia decision, the whole breadth of the court's knowledge is summed up in this simple sentence: despite the lawfulness of its origins, today we are a legitimate state. That's the entire scope of the court's knowledge onto that issue. What we've reminded the court on every occasion is that the Kaulia decision does not apply to the arguments we made concerning subject matter jurisdiction. And just for the viewers out there, Kaulia case was an issue of personal jurisdiction. Now there is a huge difference between subject matter jurisdiction and personal jurisdiction. In Kaulia and in other cases, including Lorenzo, what they're saying is that the court doesn't have any jurisdiction over me, the person, personal jurisdiction. But when you address personal jurisdiction, you have already come to a conclusion that you had subject matter jurisdiction, that the court had authority over the entire complaint, over the conduct of the action. What we reminded the court is that subject matter jurisdiction is always the first question that must be answered. Does the court have any authority to begin with? So the cases that they've cited all dealt with personal jurisdiction. We said it doesn't apply to this case. And on top of that, all the cases they've cited regarding personal jurisdiction still follows the precedent set in Lorenzo, which said is that when the defendants can provide facts and evidence to conclude that the Hawaiian Kingdom continues to exist with the attributes of state sovereign nature, then we need to consider whether our system is lawfully constituted.
You know what's interesting about this case that people may not realize with the Kaulia case?
Yeah.
I was actually contacted by Kaulia's attorney. It was a criminal case. And I provided information to him, okay, and he put in a motion to dismiss, and that they wanted to bring me in as an expert witness to provide evidence that the Hawaiian Kingdom continues to exist in accordance with State of Hawaii versus Lorenzo. Okay, that's what happened. So they went to court, and the prosecutor said, no, Your Honor, we can't allow Dr. Sai to come on to give testimony to provide the evidence that the kingdom exists. And that pretty much angered Kaulia because he's saying this is an unfair trial. And he actually, I believe he walked out of the courtroom. And now it changed the issue. So here is clear evidence that the court prevented Kaulia from providing the evidence, which State of Hawaii versus Lorenzo said he's supposed to. So that's actually in the Supreme Court case that appeal, that despite the prevention of Dr. Sai being brought on as an expert witness to provide the evidence, Kaulia didn't provide evidence that the kingdom exists. It's crazy. And, you know, with these things happening, you start to, you know how I can liken this to? You catch somebody in a lie, yeah? And they tell another lie and another lie. And pretty soon the whole thing is one big contradiction because you don't know what they're talking about. It doesn't meet any rhyme or reason. It's like just doing things. And I've been watching that. And you're seeing people do things just for the sake of doing it with no logic behind it, with no reasoning or rationality. And you can see how people get frustrated. If this is a court of law, it should be based on evidence and rules, not upon opinions. And it appears that this information is turning the courts on its head because they can't refute the evidence. So instead of addressing the evidence, they just protect their position.
Well, one of the things that I saw in a case that that you argued today was the encounter that you had with the judge. And I've seen that not only once, not only twice, but a lot, with the judge actually defending the plaintiff's position. It's not supposed to be that way. My understanding should be the plaintiff's attorney to be defending that position. Then you provide an opposition and back, and then with the evidence provided, then the judge makes a decision based on who should win based on the evidence.
Well, and that's happened a lot. But I can tell you, in fairness to the court, although this court didn't say it today, one other judge did say once before, because I'm challenging their very authority, that the court itself has some obligation to look into the arguments that we're making and perhaps dispute the arguments if it can't. I understand that. But in fairness, the courts haven't required, not once, they haven't required either the plaintiffs or the prosecution to dispute the evidence. So they've allowed the plaintiffs and the prosecution to get away with meeting their burden of showing that this court has subject matter jurisdiction. And what the courts have done is that they've not only defended their position, because that's what they're hoping to do, but by defending their position, they're also protecting the plaintiffs and the prosecution, resulting in an unfair trial to my clients.
Because of all the issues and I would call bad judgment by the judges in the courts, what has been the alternative?
Well, let me maybe first say, and I know I understand your question, is that I don't necessarily would consider it bad judgment. It is the furtherance of the illegal occupation, and as a result of that illegal occupation, it's the oppression of that courts to maintain its authority that's resulting in all these decisions. So I don't think it's bad judgment. I think it's knowing judgments. It's knowing that if they agree with us because they cannot dispute it, that what it does is it results in the extinguishment of that very system they're trying to protect.
Okay, so Dr. Sai, what's been the strategy to try to not necessarily circumvent the court's bad decisions? What's been the strategy of that? I know you went to Switzerland, for example.
Well, the strategy from the beginning, from the very beginning with all of this is compliance. Just follow the law. And when I say follow the law, that also means I got to follow the law. It's not one-sided. So it begins with compliance. In order to know how to comply and what to comply with is education. You got to be informed about what's going on. That's the key. Yeah. So when Dexter is in court presenting the arguments, when I'm writing briefs that address the continuity of the Hawaiian Kingdom and the legal system, it's a means by which we can educate people who are reading it. Okay. Now, I do know that not everybody can comprehend what they read. Okay, there's comprehension at every level.
I have problems myself sometimes.
But when you're at the legal level, there's a certain expectations that if you are speaking legal or lawful issues, you have the ability to understand and comprehend these lawful and legal issues. This is not rocket science. This is just education, okay? Now, when you start to move to comply, and then you start to realize the other side is not complying, and then it moves beyond not just the not complying, but now the injury placed upon the person that is trying to comply. Now you have a victim and a perpetrator, okay? And those are the two elements that constitute a crime, okay? And in this case, a war crime. So an unfair trial is a war crime. People may not like the word war crime, but get used to it. That's just what it is, okay? And look it up. If you want to go Wikipedia, it's up there. War crimes include unfair trials. Okay, and if it includes unfair trials, then in order to ensure that this person complies, he needs to be held accountable. So where do you go for accountability? Well, we try to seek compliance within this system here without any success because everybody is protecting their own interests and creating more victims, at the same time creating more perpetrators. So you got to go outside. And I find that the best way to see things, or the easiest way to see things, if you're not in the problem. So Switzerland, the connection that Switzerland has to Hawaii, Switzerland has a treaty with Hawaii, 1864, okay? Great Britain, which includes Canada and New Zealand. Hawaii has a treaty with Great Britain, which includes Canada and New Zealand, called the 1851 Hawaiian-British Treaty, okay? Germany has a treaty between the Hawaiian Kingdom and Germany. So when you start to go to these other countries, you start to come through the trail of law, and you point to them that we have a problem in Hawaii, and that there is a provision in your laws that says you can prosecute war crimes committed outside of your territory. And each one has their own little quirk or their own little twist on what is called universal jurisdiction, which is prosecution of crimes outside of that forum state. So that's kind of where that goes. And right now, Switzerland, there is a process going on there that the investigation will be initiated very soon because it has already gone through what is called an objections chamber, which is part of the federal criminal court, that basically vetted this information. Yeah? And in that decision that came out in April and June of this past year, specifically named Neil Abercrombie, State of Hawaii, San Tsutsui, Lieutenant Governor, and the two directors of taxation as alleged war criminals. Now, everyone is an alleged war criminal until you get convicted. Okay, even Goering, who is the Nazi head for who was put on trial in the Nuremberg Trials, he was an alleged war criminal until convicted. So everybody's alleged. Okay. But when you say alleged war crime and you have a name next to it, you better make sure you have probable cause that can substantiate that allegation. So in the Swiss criminal court objections chamber specifically named them in a decision that anybody can pull up when they go to Switzerland. It's in German, but they can pull it up. It has those names on it. That is significant. That means that Switzerland, the Attorney General or the judges, were satisfied. One, Hawaii was a country. Two, the country still exists despite the overthrow of its government. And the court even stated that the treaty between Hawaii and Switzerland wasn't canceled. So if the treaty wasn't canceled, then the party to the treaty called the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists, but it doesn't have a government. And then they allege these war criminals. So these are the things that are taking place within the international community to draw attention here in Hawaii. And it's important, but you're playing with fire here. You know, so at every stage, we try to fix this within our own house. And right now, we're getting beat up by our own family for saying the truth. It's not like anybody's running away with money. It's not like somebody's stealing something. It's just, I'm asking the right questions, provide the evidence, you can't refute it. All of a sudden, we're painted like we're criminals and we're making this stuff up. Yeah, the propaganda. So you have to go outside to expose what's going on inside. That's important. Show the light. Have that light, that spotlight here, so that people can look and see all the cockroaches running around. You know.
Well, I know. I know.
And maybe to also answer your question, Kali, what we've done is that because we've not accomplished the kind of success we were hoping for in the circuit courts or the district courts in the state of Hawaii, because again, we've always given them the opportunity first to do the right thing,
right,
to acknowledge that truth and then to comply with that truth. They're failing to do that. My clients have instructed me, and you have been one of my clients, is to take this matter further. So what we've done is we've gathered the evidence that we've presented to the court. We've got copies of the transcript of the court proceedings that has compiled our evidence, and we've shipped it out. We've actually, in many cases, like with the international criminal courts, we've now approached other avenues to have them look at this information so that they can assist us in making this system here, this judicial system, do what they should have been doing in the first place. So I also wanted to, if I can at this time, to let you know, my job is an advocate on behalf of my clients. So my job is to do what is necessary to help them prevail in their case. And there have been times, and I've had discussions with Keanu, when we present this evidence, not only we are exposing themselves, but I've often asked Keanu, why do we give all the information that we give? Because as an advocate, all I need to do is provide the information which allows us to prevail. And if the other side doesn't know some of the information, that's on them because they don't have that knowledge. Dr. Tsai's response has always been, I want to give them all the information so they cannot make any kind of excuse as to why they didn't address a particular issue. So Dr. Tsai, in his expertise, has always provided more information than I believed is necessary to advocate on behalf of my client. Now, in doing so, Dr. Tsai has exposed himself to criticism. Okay? Now, and there might be criticism, sure. But what we've asked everyone to do is that we say we're providing all of the information, all of the documentation, all of the legal research, right there for you to see yourself and criticize. If you have a legitimate criticism, then provide that to us. And the fact is that over these 5 years, not one attorney in court has provided any evidence to dispute what we've provided. So say what you will, but at least in the courts here in Hawaii, no one has been able to dispute the knowledge that Dr. Tsai has brought forth.
I know that you and Dr. Tsai put together a complaint that I think Dr. Tsai and Kaho'okahi Kanuha went to Canada to deliver to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Can you kind of touch on that for us?
Well, it begins with back in, and I forget, it's been a little while ago, but Kaho'okahi Kanuha is the young man who's one of the...
This is in regards to the TMT.
Yes, and so he is one of the organizers and the protectors of Mauna Ava Kea. And as a result of the attempts by TMT to desecrate that sacred mountain, Kaho'okahi is one of those individuals and the leaders of that group to protest and say we're not going to let that happen. And as a result of his civil protest and his stand, he was, of course, arrested, unlawfully confined, and is presently going through the court proceeding. After his initial arrest, he met with me, and I think he met with Dr. Tsai. And what we were trying to do at the time was to prevent the TMTs from being part of any further arrests on the mountain. So what we did, I believe, I can't remember the date, but I believe it was April 16th, I hand-delivered a letter to the attorney for the TMT and its associates, asking them to cease and desist any further arrests on the mountain. We provided them all of the information that we've been doing in the courts, letting this attorney know and his office know that, again, this is not the state of Hawaii. This is the Hawaiian Kingdom. And any acts taken by its office or the TMT, which would either unlawfully confine my clients or expose them to an unlawful, unfair trial, would be reported as violations. As you know, and through its history, you know that the TMT and its attorneys have, in fact, violated that cease and desist order. There have been more arrests. As a result of that, a complaint was filed and drafted with Dr. Tsai and Kaho'okahi, and that complaint was now reporting it to the Canadian authorities that a member of its own citizenry or the organization had in fact committed war crimes against our citizens. And I can have Dr. Sai explain more of the details, but it was Dr. Sai and Kaho'okahi that traveled to Canada to deliver those complaints. So why don't I just let Dr. Sai take over from there?
So Canada has a war crime statute where they can prosecute crimes committed outside of Canadian territory. So TMT, one of its partners is a Canadian astronomy group, okay? So that was the link to the Canadian government, you know? So you're always looking at how do you seek compliance? You know, the number one thing is comply. So when we looked and found that, we said, well, let's bring it to the attention. And so Dexter and I were speaking about with Kaho'okahi to the authorities. And Royal Canadian Mounted Police, called the RCMP, has a special unit, an investigative unit that does investigations of war crimes, okay? Now, when we met with them, with the information and 2 binders of the information, I knew, and Dexter knew, that this war crimes unit of the RCMP works with the Department of Justice of Canada. They have a war crime program that gets into it. So it's very complicated, this issue. You cannot just take it before a detective and say, hey, figure this out. You know, so they rely on this war crimes program in the Department of Justice because of the complexity and because of international law as well. Yeah. So when we first met with them, they at first were taken aback. They said, no, but Hawaii's a part of the United States. I said, well, we understand why you think that, but it's actually not. But we're not here to try to convince you of that. It's all in the paperwork. Okay? And if you can present that to the war crimes program at the Department of Justice, I'm sure they can explain to you why that's not the case. But we surely don't have time here to explain all of this to you. We're just here reporting a crime to initiate the process. And then that individual, another constable, which is what they call themselves, a constable, detective said, but Hawaii, where is the armed conflict? I said, well, armed conflicts include occupations, Article 2, Geneva Convention. And real quickly, that constable said, okay, got it. You know, so you're talking the language. You know, you're not trying to prove anything. We're just here to report the crime. If you prove that Hawaii is not part of, if you prove that Hawaii is a part of the United States, then those are war crimes. No problem. You know, so, but here's the information. And then we finally left with the Canadian authorities telling us, well, we have to respect the U.S.-Canadian treaty. I said, no, absolutely, you have to. But it doesn't apply to Hawaii because we're not in America. You have to respect the Hawaiian-British treaty that applies to Hawaii. So all we said was, we just want you to do a preliminary inquiry to determine whether or not there's probable cause to move forward. And he said, we can do that. Well, Dexter received a letter, July 17th?
Yes, July 17th. Yes.
So he passed it on to me after he reviewed it, and I looked at it and I went, wow, this is really good. They said that they provided information. This is a response to Dexter's complaint. They provided this information and the 2 binders that I provided them to the Department of Justice War Crimes Program. And that in response, they say that Canada does not have jurisdiction on these issues in accordance with Section 8 of the War Crimes Statute of Canada. Okay, so Section 8, because everything is connected. Okay, pull up Section 8. Section 8 merely covers identifying who are perpetrators and who are victims. And a perpetrator has to be either a Canadian citizen or somebody employed by a Canadian citizen. And a victim has to be a Canadian citizen. So in this case, Kaho'okahi does not meet that criteria of being a victim because he's not a Canadian citizen. But the attorney that Dexter was talking about would apply to a perpetrator under Section 8, where it says that a perpetrator can be a person employed by Canada in a civil capacity. Okay, so basically these issues are going to be dealt with where the RCMP just opened the door, and it's looking at more for a clarification and not saying there's no war crimes being committed in Hawaii because Hawaii is a part of the United States. No, it's a very straightforward letter, and they know the severity of the situation when you're speaking to war crimes.
Yes. And just to clarify, actually the date of the letter was July 2nd. It was postmarked July 17th, and it was received by my address probably sometime within the next 2 weeks after that.
Well, okay. So I just have a couple more minutes, and in those 2 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, explain to us the situation in New Zealand.
Well, a New Zealand citizen came to the realization that she's in an occupied territory. As a tourist, she was pillaged, not taxed, but pillaged. Hotel room tax, general excise tax, highway tax. I mean, I didn't realize how tourists get taxed until I looked at it. I was like, wow, you folks pay a lot of money when you visit to Hawaii. I didn't know that. She set up meetings for me to meet with members of parliament and a cabinet minister in Auckland. We met with them, and they were blown away. The one thing that they were very much blown away with was the fact that Hawaii was a country. They didn't realize Hawaii was a country as an independent state, and they didn't realize when I said to them that Hawaii, the Hawaiian Kingdom, had a consulate in Auckland and Dunedin, which is a South Island. They were like, really? I go, yeah, right here, look. They were shocked. And then they zeroed in on the treaty of 1851 between the British Crown and the Hawaiian Kingdom, which would apply to Canada as well as New Zealand, all the British Commonwealths. So they're called the Commonwealth realms. Yeah, there's 16 countries, including Great Britain, that recognizes the Queen of England as the head of state. All her treaties apply to all of the members, including New Zealand. So they want to move forward with the committee of inquiry, yeah, at the parliamentary level on the legal status of Hawaii, and then also at the cabinet level, get into the issue of verifying that Hawaii has a treaty with New Zealand. And this woman, Dr. Meta Penihita, who's from the University of Auckland, who decided to be open with her name, she filed a war crime complaint with their Attorney General on war crimes committed in Hawaii. So the Attorney General in the Attorney General in New Zealand, I'm sure would be in contact very soon with the RCMP in Canada, because they're all part of the Commonwealth, and they receive the same information. So the ramifications are profound. But again, we're not looking at burning the house down. What we're doing is seeking compliance within the house and to prevent the house from burning down. That's the key.
Our house, not their house now.
Exactly.
That's
Our
the
house, not their house.
Yeah. So we're giving them the clean water, not the dirty water.
Yeah. That's another story for us to tell you about on the next episode, because I will have the person who came up with that analogy on the show. It's been really interesting in watching and attending the courts and watching the courts provide unfair trials, to people here in Hawaii. And it's not just people that are Hawaiian in blood. It's been Haole, Filipino, Japanese, whoever, because the court system is here illegally in the Hawaiian Kingdom. And so as a result of that, we had to take it to the international level. And so with all of this, I hope all of you will begin to take a look and understand and learn how important it is to see what's taking place. Go on to hawaiiankingdom.org/blog. That's Dr. Sai's blog, with a lot of information that's coming out. And as a result of that, what's taking place in Haleakala, as well as Mauna Kea, everybody has been learning, and the terminologies from 10 years ago are totally different as a result. And it's programs like this that will help you begin to understand it and ask more questions so that you can learn. I really appreciate you joining us tonight, and I hope you join us on the next show. And again, mahalo to my guests, Attorney Dexter Kaiama and Dr. Keanu Sai.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Until then, ahui ho.